CI is some of our first sponsors that we've ever received, and the chapter was first founded 4 years ago. So we really appreciate being here again. It's been a while. It's great to be back. So let's just move forward and get on with this wonderful panel. I'm going to introduce you very quickly, Carol Ogilvie. She's going to be moderating our event. She's a board member of the chapter. She's a scholar of women's gender studies in sports and sports psychology. Carol was principal author and contributor of the UN Division of the Advancement of Women monograph entitled Women, Gender Equality in Sport. It was released in 2008. Carol received a PhD in kinesiology at Purdue University in 1969 and a PhD in counseling at Temple University in 1999. She organized this amazing panel, and please welcome Carol.
Thank you, Kathy, very much, and Ian for our beautiful space. And mostly I'm appreciative of my great panel. You'll find out very soon just how great they are. Tonight, with the help of this blue ribbon gold medal panel before you, we're going to explore together ideas about media, gender, and sport. Our title tonight, Media Represents Women's Sport, highlights the duality of women engaged in sport, theoretically presented in the media, and yet literally and figuratively active, strong women are repositioned in a manner that's chosen by the creators of media. So here's how we go. First, I'm going to give you a very short bio sketch with each presenter. Believe me, if I gave you the full deal, the full Monty, so to speak, we'd be finished by the time the intros were finished. So short one, then Michael, Faye, Julia, and Dawn are going to share their thoughts about the media, women in sport. It's going to be a bit of a jazz riff thing where each one is giving their own take. Some voices will come from academia and research. Some voices will come more from advocacy and years of trying to change the media or the public response to media. Some voices will be directly from athletes and performers and the many, many experiences they've had dealing with and coping with the media, all the while trying to define themselves in their own terms. So, importantly for you to remember too, we have a healthy chunk of time at the end for exchanges with you. So as the speakers engage you and questions and comments arise, in your own thinking, don't be shy to jot them down and be ready to dialogue later on. All right, our panel. First off, directly to my left, Dr. Michael Messner is the authentic, real deal he for she gentleman. I can promise you that. Long before that he for she label became celebrity, he self-identified as a feminist scholar as long ago as 1990 in a publication of the classic Men's Sport and the Gender Order. Today he's a distinguished professor at USC. He has publication lists and award lists that go on and on. My favorite of all of them, I wanted to choose from one, the Jesse Bernard International Prize for Discipline from the American Sociology Association. 2 books to remember if you are wandering on Amazon.com, Some Men, Feminist Allies, and the Movement to End Violence Against Women, and the second, It's All for Kids, Gender, Families, and Youth Sport. Number 2 slot, Dr. Faye Wachs, professor in the Department of Psychology and Sociology at California State Polytechnic University in Pomona. She's been a visiting professor also at Loyola Marymount and the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Wachs' most recent book, entitled Body Panic, Gender, Health, and the Selling of Fitness, was co-authored with sociologist Sherry Dworkin, and that book won the 2010 Distinguished Book Award from the Sociology of Sport Association. Dr. Wachs is one of 2 on our panel with special interest in the STEM fields. She's been the co-PI on a National Science Foundation grant studying the effects of stereotype threat on girls and math performance. She also gets activity credits for her commitment to hiking, running, biking, and sailing. Yay, good for you. Number 3 slot, Julia Landauer, is a NASCAR champion from New York with a record including 27 wins in 120 races and 41 top 3 finishes. Julia has explored and won in all types of racing, including go-karts, formula cars, and stock cars. In addition to racing every season since she was 10 years old, imagine that, she's a 2014 grad of Stanford University with degree in science, technology, and society. Among her civic contributions, she advocates consistently for women in the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math. And batting cleanup, I'm a softball player, in the number 4 slot is Dawn Ellerby. For the past 4 years, Dawn has been Associate Athletic Director for Marketing, Branding, and Fan Development at Cal State Northridge. Prior to that time, at her alma mater, she was Director of Marketing, Events, and Public Relations for the University of South Carolina, a major sport institution nationally. Dawn is a gold medalist in hammer throw at the Pan American Games. For a time, she held the American world record in the hammer throw, and also the world record, in the hammer throw. She, here at home, won a championship with the NCAA 4 times and was a 12-time USA champion. In South Carolina, Dawn launched many successful community outreach campaigns in support of literacy, health, and wellness. Her Read with Gamecocks campaign reached 678 elementary schools and over 4,000 students. So you see what I mean when I say this is a blue ribbon panel. So please welcome them now, starting with Matthew.
Thank you very much, Carol. It's really nice to be here with this distinguished panel, and especially to be introduced by Carol Oglesby, who, as you may have already gotten a hint of, is really an icon in the field of women's sports advocacy and research, a real true scholar, activist that's been an inspiration to many of us. So thank you. I also want to say, it has nothing to do with sport, but I was inspired by the presentation here by our host and the culture of peace, that the research I've been doing lately has been with war veterans who are peace activists, and so I'm moved by the words and by the setting that we're in right now, because I feel as though I've been immersed in a different kind of culture of peace in over the last couple of years with my research. But the body of my research over time has been focused very much on gender in sports, and so I thought what I would do as a lead off here is do a kind of a big picture, where are we now perspective that I know my colleagues then will zero in on in different ways, and then we can have a discussion. And it seems to me that we're at a time now in history where there are a couple of different narratives when people mention gender in sports or women in sports, and one of those narratives is a very rosy one. It says something like, 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, when I was growing up, for sure, sports really were by and for and about men, and women were not, and girls were not, for the most part, given opportunities to play and compete. And today, all this time later, there's been this explosion and this sports revolution, and girls and women are now have no kind of equalized and leveled the playing field with men, and this is very beneficial to girls and women to have done that. The other narrative, and I hear this more among academics in my field, is not so fast. There's still a lot of discrimination against girls and women. The revolution has actually ended or gotten stalled, and things are really pretty bad in terms of girls and women's experiences and opportunities in sports and sports media and so forth. And I think both of those narratives have a grain of truth to them, but standing alone, both of those narratives are not really empirically supportable. And worse, I think they're disempowering. And I thought the little video up here that we saw beforehand about the potential empowering kind of vehicle that sport can be for girls was very appropriate and apt. So I think, my perspective as a social scientist has been all along, for a good number of years, to think about how things have changed and how they have not simultaneously. And I guess my punchline would be, it's not exactly time for a feminist victory lap in terms of thinking about women's progress in sport, but it's really important to chronicle how and why we have come so far in a few decades in terms of moving towards greater respect, higher opportunities, and so forth for girls and women's sport. So what makes sense for me, and I've been working on this idea with a couple of colleagues, is to think about history in terms of not just like progress and regress, but in a more complicated way as a kind of unevenness of social change. There are some sectors of society where we've seen pretty rapid social change in terms of girls and women's and sports, and some sectors of society where it's been very slow or almost non-existent. And I'm really interested in trying to understand that unevenness of social change. A few examples, youth sports, which is something that I've studied a bit and wrote a book about. The movement of girls into youth sports has been dramatic. It's been a sea change in the last 30 or 40 years. And opinion polls will tell you parents are fully supportive of all social classes. They're fully supportive of their daughters playing sports. They know that playing sports can be healthy for them, empowering for them, and help them become more competitive in a world that still doesn't treat girls equally and might even be threatening to girls in some ways. But on the other hand, girls still don't have the same opportunities that boys have in some places in sports. We know that girls still at a younger age tend to start bailing out of sports around that adolescent period in higher numbers than boys do. Youth sports, and one of the angles I studied was in youth sports, soccer, little league, that sort of thing. The vast majority of coaches still are men, and the women who volunteer to get involved are oftentimes channeled or relegated into being, quote, team moms. And so there's a whole range of ways in which things have changed and things have not changed so much in youth sports, which I find very interesting. Same is true with high school and college sports. Again, the numbers are astounding how much they've changed over the past 3 or 4 decades. With the passage of Title IX in the United States, girls and their families and women and their families in college and high school have been able to use the law really as a bludgeon to force institutions to create equal opportunities for girls and women in sports. And yet, even though that has been successful in organizations like here in LA, the California Women's Law Center, and organizations like the National Women's Law Center, National Organization for Women, have been very powerful as advocacy groups for girls in sports, and the law, of course, in the Title IX as well. You still see fewer girls' opportunities in some places. You see substandard fields and girls and their families having to fight for better facilities. You see other sorts of problems having to do with sexual harassment and also with leadership issues in high school and college. It's very interesting that as some money has flowed into college sports for women over the last 20 or 30 years, that the proportion of coaches who are women in college and university sports has dropped pretty dramatically, and as men have flowed into coaching positions. And then with professional sports, I think it's a picture that's probably even in most cases more bleak in the sense of having the amount of money and opportunities that women have compared to the opportunities that men have. And we have seen some activism by women professional athletes in recent years, very publicly pressing for equal pay for the work that they do. And then another field, and this is what I'll spend the rest of my time talking about, and what I've handed out to you, is something that I've studied for the last 25, 26, 27 years now is media coverage of women's and men's sports. And another place where we see this some kind of unevenness of social change. Just in a quick nutshell, the handout that I gave you is just a couple of graphics from this most recent iteration of this 25-year longitudinal study I started doing back in the late 80s with Margaret Carlisle Duncan of the University of Wisconsin. And the first few times we did this, we were sponsored by what was then called the Amateur Athletics Foundation of Los Angeles. It's now called the LA 84 Foundation. If you're interested in sports at all, it's over on Adams Boulevard. It's a beautiful facility that was funded by the money that was, the profits that were made by the 1984 games here in Los Angeles. And they have a beautiful library, and they do a lot of very progressive stuff in the city with youth, particularly underprivileged youth. But anyway, they funded us to do this analysis of media coverage of women's and men's sports that we did back in, the first one, as you can see on here, was 1989. We studied the 3 local network affiliates, and we also did a newspaper study back then that we didn't continue, but we continued the TV study over time. And in about the 3rd iteration of the study, we added Sports Center, ESPN Sports Center, because we realized that's where a lot of people were getting their sports information from. I guess what you can see from this is that, you know, we had a sort of moment in the 1999 study where we were feeling a little bit optimistic, like finally maybe the proportion of coverage of women's sports was starting to go up, and there were a lot of questions about, is that going to continue to climb? And as you can see, it certainly did not. And by the time we got to the 2009 and then the 2014 iterations of the study, the proportion of coverage on these 3 LA network affiliates and ESPN Sports Center had plummeted and remained very low. And so what you have there on those shows is just a cacophony of stories about men's sports and for the most part narrated by male commentators. And then the sort of pie chart that you see below is just the 2014 numbers of what sports were covered when they did cover on these sorts of news and highlight shows. And you can see it's mostly what you call the big 3 men's sports: football, basketball, baseball. And that's mostly, we're talking about pro and college football and basketball and pro baseball. And then tiny, tiny amounts for other men's sports and for women's sports. And the one change over time in that respect was in 10, 15 years ago, the sport that drew the most coverage for women's sports was tennis. And in the last couple of times, it's been supplanted by basketball, although the numbers are still quite small compared to everything else. When women's sports were covered, it tended more to be basketball more recently. Now, lest I sort of leave you with the impression that I'm erring on the side of the pessimistic and dismal narrative that I started with, I think this is an example, I think, that I could use for the unevenness of social change, in the sense that this is just one thing that we're looking at. It's news and highlight shows over time. And in fact, it has not improved in terms of the quantitative coverage of women's sports. But one of the things that has changed in that study, and you can see the citation at the end, and you can find this study on my website. There's no paywall on there. You can get this in any of my other articles by just opening that up and clicking on it, and you can see the whole article. And one of the things that we also looked at was the qualitative analysis of, and I should add, Faye Wax was a research assistant on what, the 99 one, or 93? 94 one. Okay, so when she was a PhD student at USC. In those early iterations of the study, one of which Faye worked on, it wasn't just low coverage quantitatively of women's sports. It was, when they did cover women's sports, it was incredibly insulting. It was so bad that you kind of almost wish they didn't mention women's sports. They made fun of women, they sexually objectified them, and it was like oh, dare I use this term, locker room garbage. It was like listening to guys kind of talk in a locker room in ways that you would imagine they do, but they're doing it publicly over the airwaves on KNBC and so forth. So it was really kind of insulting and demeaning sexual humor about women and women's sports. Now, in the last 2 times we've done this study, that kind of sexual objectification and insulting kinds of talk about women and women's sports has mostly gone away. They just aren't doing that. I wouldn't say at all, but hardly at all anymore, especially compared to the way they were doing it 15, 20, 30 years ago, 25 years ago. So I think part of that is a testament to the criticism, because here's the thing. If you watch the TV news on on KNBC, KABC, it's the same guys who were doing it 25 years ago. Now, I'm not at all against people having long tenure in their jobs. I have that in my job too, so I wouldn't say people should be, taken out of their jobs. They do a fine job. But those guys have changed in terms of the tone with which they use to describe women's sports. On the other hand, the amount of time they talk about women's sports is so low that you get the sense that once they decided they couldn't be sexually insulting towards women, they decided not to talk about them pretty much at all. So there's been that's kind of a mixed bag. Now, the other part of this, though, that I think is really important to think about is this is just TV news and highlights. There's a tremendous amount of other media out there that has changed in much more dramatic ways over the last 25 years. I love watching women's hoops, college women's basketball. I go to all of the USC women's games, and every year I hope they're going to get a little bit better. And I have a really good time with that. And 25 years ago, when we were doing this study, we sampled in March, during March Madness, and the coverage of the women's NCAA tournament was dismal, and you could not catch a game on TV, and they played the Final Four national championship games on late night tape delay at like 11 or 12 midnight, and it was terrible production values. It was almost as though you wouldn't want to watch it even if you cared, because it was so badly done. Now, not only did they show the Final Four and with pretty high production values, but you can catch a lot of the rest of the women's NCAA tournament, much of it on ESPN in recent years. And you can also, if you like watching Pac-12 women's basketball, you can watch quite a bit of it on the Pac-12 network here locally as well. So I think there's a really amazing unevenness happening here, that in some sectors of the media you're seeing a tremendous amount of improvement with certain sports, one that I happen to like a lot, college basketball. In other sectors of the media, you're not seeing much change at all, and if you are seeing change, it's kind of an ambivalent mix of change, like with the news and highlight shows. And I guess one of the questions that I have, and I'm not a marketing person, nor am I a media economist, but one of the things that's really puzzled me over the last 10 years is that ESPN has been one of those stations that has been doing a lot more and a lot better job showing live play-by-play women's basketball. But if you go over to ESPN Sports Center, it's as though it's not happening at all. And it's the same company and the same network, and you would think they'd be using Sports Center to cross-market for the shows that they're actually showing. I would think. You see this on networks, like whatever network is showing the Olympics, they spend a big chunk of their news time covering the Olympics, and the other networks aren't doing that very much, because they know if you cover it on their news that it's going to help increase their viewers on the actual show, and vice versa. It kind of extends the pleasure, it holds the viewers, all of that. ESPN doesn't do this with SportsCenter. I suppose I will stop there. I've probably gone over my time already. This is a professor thing. You got to give me the hook, right? But I will mention one last thing, if people are interested in talking about this later, which is that I haven't mentioned boys and men at all. And this has been one of the major things that I've studied over my careers: boys, men, sports. And one of the things that really has always worried me a little bit about women's sports advocacy is we often advocate for girls and women to have equality in sports in exactly the way they exist. And sports for boys and men has been pretty screwed up in a lot of ways, right? And it's really bad for boys in certain ways, and it's good for boys in other ways when they play sports. And so I'm really interested in thinking about how, as we build equity and create more and more opportunities for girls and women in sports, that we're also critically looking at sports, the way we organize it, especially for kids and for young people, in terms of health correlates and injuries and attitudes about cooperation and competition and commercialization that's permeating all the way down into youth sports and how that impacts it. So if you'd like to talk more a little bit later about boys, I'd be happy to do that. But we have also fascinating 3 other panelists. So I don't want to steal more time from at the moment. So thank you.
You're going to see a lot of the mic going up and down, I think, with this group. People frequently ask me if I see the new technologies and new media technologies as good or bad for women and sports and teaching, frankly, even the world at times. And no matter the context, the question isn't whether technologies and new media are good or bad. I mean, there's no doubt that it's both. It's a complicated history of triumphs and tragedies. It's doing some justice and some injustice. The question we need to focus on are access, content, control, cost, and who's bearing the cost for these things. So I think it's important to some degree that sports media be interrogated with these same questions, and we need to consider how sports media is changing and evolving. I'm hoping in the next study that we'll see a wider range of media is considered, because my students are not watching SportsCenter anymore, right? They're using apps. Mike and Cheryl's work highlights the lack of coverage for women in sports and the failure to improve in traditional media in some ways, but in other ways to still improve. Even the Olympics, one of the events that has a high female viewership and therefore has a good degree of coverage of women, still has some problems. My own research on the 2014 Sochi Games found a lot of traditional gender markers in coverage, though not the most offensive ones. Female athletes are more likely to be contextualized relative to families, in particular children and spouses, assuming that your spouse is male. Injury is more likely to be mentioned relative to female athletes, and male athletes are more likely to be mentioned by name. We also saw more gendered or gender-specific comments made about female athletes, and gendered coverage by sports in the Olympics still exists, meaning that gender-appropriate sports tend to get a lot more coverage. So men's hockey got a lot more coverage than women's hockey, and women's figure skating got a lot more coverage than men's figure skating. And of course, this has a lot to do with the viewership of the Olympics being more than 50% female, so you see a very different kind of coverage of this event. But we also sort of took a look at what the athletes were able to say, because the Olympics is the biggest venue in the world for these athletes. And what we found was that even in the influx of this new media, athletes are very much expected to shut up and perform and not express any kind of anything unless it's sort of a very positive advocacy. They're not allowed to be political. They're not allowed to mention sponsors if they aren't official sponsors. But it was also in our coding of NBC that I realized how much of what I thought of as media was actually social media. That I was more like my students at this point than my parents, I guess. In my world, there were tremendous number of discussions of GLBTQAA rights and human rights violations and politics. And this seemed so prominent to me that when I actually took a look and coded mainstream coverage of the Olympics, for want of a better word, it seemed very theoretically vanilla. The fundamental, one of the things that I took from Mike very early on was this idea of what's inside the frame and what's outside the frame. And that what's outside the frame is completely unthought of or undiscussed or not put within the context of being an issue related to that thing. And so I had to ask this question of what is a women's sports issue into relation to how sports are covered by media, and how is this targeted coverage that we're seeing with social media really changing and shaping what this means? Certainly throughout my research in general, the increasing role of media in shaping civic discourse in ways detrimental to meaningful debate over critical issues is obvious. Sports and health coverage is one arena that renders visible these problems. For Sue Jolly, I have to do a little theory, sorry, I'm an academic. Sue Jolly talks about the sports media complex, which is the interrelationship between Western sports and for-profit media interests. And he really highlights how over time, originally sports were a great way to generate profit for media, but the relationship power-wise has really flipped, where sports are really dependent on media now for the bulk of their revenue. And this changes how sports are presented and what is presented as sports. And increasingly, we're noticing the same process occurring with health and fitness markets and audiences, so that your health and fitness is now a market. It's not something about your body. And as a result, much of our idealized imagery of health and fit bodies depict bodies that have actually adopted practices that are antithetical to health, or at best irrelevant to it. Considering what's inside and what's outside the frame in this is about power. Foucault uses the realm of the fathomable to capture that we don't even think about certain things as being relevant when we're talking about something. That some types of knowledge claims are left out, that this isn't an issue. So what Sherry and I found in our work is that to be pudgy and healthy is a reality for many and very invisible in sports media and in media in general for health. There's no scientific parameters really behind body mass index, yet we all use this as a marker of health. And it also hasn't been updated to reflect the wide range of ethnicities that this is now. I'd like to point out, school funding is in part determined by how schools do on this measure as part of the California Fitness Grant. Because it's not adjusted in any way for race or ethnicity or social class, the schools at which a certain type of kids are clustered are going to get less funding for their physical education programs. Where I'm teaching out in Pomona, for example, one of the years we got a grant for them. It sounds like a girls' sports issue. When writing Body Panic with Sherry's work, and one of the things that struck us was the evolution and eventual extinction of Women's Sports and Fitness, the magazine. And it was interesting because when we started doing this, this was the magazine we both independently subscribed to because it was different. Originally, it was actually founded as part of the Women's Sports Foundation. It was then bought by Condé Nast, and eventually you got Self instead of Women's Sports and Fitness. And this really exemplified the process by which we argue feminism itself has become commodified or turned into a market-driven force rather than as much of a movement. This idea comes from a scholar named Robert Goldman, and he points out all the different ways that feminism has actually been co-opted into advertising symbols within popular culture that don't actually reflect any benefits or gains for any more than a small select group of women who can afford to be part of that market. And again, this is better, right? I mean, it's better that I was also a softball player, and for a long time I could not find women's cleats that fit me. And having options in the marketplace is not a bad thing, but we sort of have to ask ourselves is what sorts of issues are outside the frame and what girls and women are left outside of this frame. In our larger project, we expand on the commodification of health and fitness, and we build on this extensive literature on the objectification of women in consumer culture. And what we found over time was not that the objectification of women got better, but that the objectification of men happened. And so that what we started to see in terms of health was that men and women both started to have very unrealistic health expectations coming primarily from their relationship with the media, and that men began to display the same bodily insecurities that we were seeing among women. But in addition to that, fitness in our culture, it doesn't just create your problem, your bodily problems, your lack of a 4-pack, or, one man said, gee, I used to need a 4-pack, then I needed a 6-pack, now I need an 8-pack, like when do I get to stop? Right? It's made men just as insecure as women, but it also markets us the solutions to our problems if we can afford to buy them. Certainly, a wider range of bodies has entered the realm of acceptable for both men and women, but I think our observations about normative gender remains relevant. Former students routinely send me examples of gendered self-care products that really shouldn't be gendered, right? I'm waiting for them to gender toothpaste. This is for a man's smile, this is for a woman's smile, right? And despite all of this broadening and the greater awareness surrounding GLBTQAA issues, the gender binary remains intact. right? The potential destabilization of the world's greatest athlete of 1976 announcing that he is actually a transgendered woman did not destabilize the binary. It did open up a degree of discussion about transgendered rights, but this sort of led to we need new rules to keep these boundaries in place, not questioning perhaps these boundaries don't need to be here at all. And don't get me wrong, this is absolutely progress compared to no such thing as a gay hero. But it's hard to ignore how discussions of health, fitness, and bodies now take place where the symbolic and the individual intersect, and that most of us are very frustrated, and we're solving that frustration in a marketplace devoid of imagery that captures our reality. And when it does, it's that dissatisfaction being channeled back to us in body positivity campaigns. So when Dove Soap poignantly shows us images of how we've become our own worst critic, or the Huffington Post sends us a piece on femvertising, we sort of have to ask, where did these negative images that we're full of come from in the first place, and aren't we solving them in the exact same place that gave them to us? The market creates the problem and it offers the solutions. Another example is the spate of stories of poorly behaving male athletes. They've highlighted the crimes, but they haven't really highlighted the fact these have all been high-profile male athletes. Recent coverage of athletes' sexual assault and sentences of varying lengths and internet culture have really glossed over sports and masculinity and some of the negative things that can happen when bodies are overprivileged. And it sort of was ironic to me that Mike and I were part of a short-lived but very theoretically vibrant sport violence research group at USC in, I think, 1994, where we talked about the problem of sexual assault, sport, and rape culture. And it's wonderful to hear this in the mainstream media now, but I'm thinking we were having these same discussions in 1994. And I also have to question the possibility of ending rape culture in a context in which those of us who mostly agree talk to each other while advertisements stream by, and somewhere else the components of rape culture are being equally made profitable, and somebody else is sitting there ranting about false accusations and the war on men while another set of advertisements stream by with equal fervor. Endorsing and funding projects that increase access for girls and women to formerly male-dominated sports, like Becky Beal's work on skateboarding in the Bay Area, like the video we saw to open this, is an investment in public access to sport and leisure, and it creates an affordable space for all of us, not just high-performing athletes. Keeping public awareness of the state and women and girls beyond a few feel-good stories around the world is imperative to giving us access to what we need to actually participate in a sport. Take for a moment and consider the rare instances of coverage of participatory athletic events and health campaigns. Corporate sponsorship and cause-based tie-ins make such events much more about positive corporate advertising than a genuine commitment to changing disease contexts. Samantha King highlights the creation of a commodified experience in the participation of charities affiliated with these sorts of events. Such events and injunctions to exercise certainly highlight individual moral commitments to bodies and our abilities to raise a not insubstantial amount of money and to engage in relatively time-consuming regimes in safe, protected, open spaces. What remains invisible are all the different ways that public discourse impacted this. Public discourse impacts our access to health information, to our park space, to our recreation space, to our leisure space. When I was a kid, when you went down to the public park, the park director came out there and got all the boys and all the girls together and said, you kids are playing a sport. And he taught us to play basketball, he taught us to play football, he taught us to play baseball. That position doesn't exist anymore. Parks don't have that person anymore because we've chosen to defund it. And so I would like to ask us to think much more broadly about sports media and to think about the local, to think about all the ways that our communities are being ignored when we think about sports media. People have this nostalgia for when it was safe to play outside. But first we have to ask, safe for whom? And second, we have to acknowledge that we chose to defund our parks. We did it knowingly and we did it willfully. Replacing impromptu games with organized leagues shapes sports in many ways that are antithetical to the values we claim we will inculcate youth with, as Jay Coakley work so poignantly shows us, kids going to the park and playing sports. is where they get these really positive gains. Kids in high-level athletic leagues get some gains, but they don't get the same gains in moral leadership that you get from organizing it yourself. What we create are predictable and specific consumer markets, and the acritical, commodified nature of sports and sports media needs to be challenged. So how do we do this, right? What do we do next? Well, first of all, I'd like to point out we have a big election coming up, and I know that a lot of people, you're all aware of this, right? And we've all been focused on the national, but we have a local too. Here in Los Angeles, over the last maybe 15 years, we have seen a defunding of our public space and a privatization of our public space. What is this going to mean for everyone's ability to recreate in this city? Right now they're talking about privatizing the zoo. I don't know if that's going to change the zoo or not, but Griffith Park is the closest thing we have to Central Park in a city where we can be outside pretty much 365 days a year. Even if it's raining, wait a few hours, it'll be fine, right? And yet we have less open space than New York City. And we're defunding the little tiny bit that we have. And this is not ever considered a sport media issue. This is a sport issue. This is a girls and women's in sports issue. Sports media is at the forefront of the battle to keep sports, health, and fitness depoliticized and limited in its scope. Scholars note that increasingly corporate elites control the dissemination of information, and their interests are going to obscure our interests. Within my own research, the depolitization of the professional and amateur sports coverage was driven home by we coded information on the Sochi Games for 2 months after the Olympics. Not one article mentioned, I don't know, the invasion of the Ukraine, the day, literally, it was almost minutes, it was hours after the closing ceremonies ended. And so I think that we need to take this broader look, and I just want to close on the public space issue, because I'm, as I said, I teach in Pomona. And when I talk to women and girls in Pomona, the primary thing that keeps them from being able to participate in sports and fitness of any kind is their inability to go to public parks and be safe. To not be sexually assaulted in the restrooms, to not be shot on the playground. And even I work with the Boys and Girls Club, and the very underfunded Boys and Girls Club is one of the few places where they're actually getting any kind of support. So I'd really like to challenge us to push the boundaries on what is sports media. Thank you.
Hey guys, thanks for spending your night with us and engaging in this conversation. So this is really interesting because racing is fairly, sorry, I'm going to work on this for a second. Racing is fairly different from other sports because there's no female league and there's no male league, right? We all compete together. So when Carol asked me about the media representation of women in sports in racing, it's a little different because we have Danica Patrick, who's really the one at the top, and she's kind of set the tone, right? She hasn't had any rules that she's had to follow. And so in some ways that almost boxes the rest of us, the handful of us that are up and coming, into fitting in a mold. But what I really want to focus on is more kind of media in general and how media kind of portrays women and then how that counters with what we have to do to be really successful in racing. And so some quick background, part of the reason my parents got me and my sister into go-karts was because it was one of the few sports where girls could compete with boys. They figured, hey, they got to do it in the real world, might as well start them young. And so that was so cool that there wasn't this biological limiting factor. We needed to be strong, but not brute strength. We needed endurance strength. And so we got to participate head-to-head with the boys. And it's definitely a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, I do something that's, pretty good, maybe not astounding, but pretty good. And I get so much media coverage for it. Like, I'm awesome. I just tied for highest finishing female in my series, which is second, right? Which is good, but it's not the win, but we got a lot of press for it. On the other hand, I'm in a development series, and so when I'm learning, I'm also under a magnifying glass, and it's really pointed out when I'm learning too slowly or if I'm making mistakes. So it's this double-edged sword of being a woman in racing and how the media relates to me and my coverage. But, part of what has always confused me is, with racing being not biologically segregated, why are there so few women in racing? And a lot of it is a cultural thing, right? It was the dads and the boys in this little club that went out and went racing, and they liked cars, and they just assumed their girls wouldn't like cars. And so I became really interested in this when I went to Stanford. What were some cultural differences between how girls behaved and how boys behaved, or how girls competed with a team or worked with a team, because racing is a team sport. Without the guys who work on the car, I can't drive, and without me, they can't win. And so I really started looking into this, and so much of what our culture tells girls to be is nice. And nice is pretty passive, right? It's good to be nice, but that alone shouldn't be the emphasis of what you want to do to be successful. And so I kind of dove into a few more things and different, stereotypes of women that I thought, okay, they're probably holding us back in the sport, and I'd like to share a few stories with you. One was about learning how to be aggressive, right? Because an aggressive woman is the B word, but an aggressive man is, assertive, powerful, going after it. And when I was 14, I was racing in a national go-kart race. And I had been doing really well in practice, but then come qualifying, when the competition really started, I kind of leveled out. And this had happened before, and my coach was really frustrated, my parents were really frustrated, and so was I. So we went home that night, and I went to sleep, and then my dad came into my hotel room before my alarm went off the next morning. So I knew that something was up. And he walks over to my bed and says, "Julia, get up." And then he takes me by the shoulders and he screams, "You need to rip their livers out! These boys got beat by a girl the other day. They are pissed, and you need to be just as angry." And it was terrifying before 7 o'clock in the morning of race day, but he was essentially giving me permission to absolutely obliterate my competition, which I promise you was not a message that I was getting in middle school, right? In private school in New York City, that's not what we were taught. And so I realized I was getting this message from how I spent all my days at school, which was very different than what I needed to be successful. And then another kind of message about that I learned was kind of taking ownership of your situation. In racing, as with other team sports, your team is depending on you. You have your job that you need to do, and the success of the team depends on that. And when I was racing once when I was 10 or so, we were having a mediocre weekend. It was just a local race. And after the qualifying run, I asked my parents to make a change to the go-kart. And, they made the change, and I went out for the race. And it was awful. I mean, I was still slow. I was getting frustrated, so then I wasn't driving properly, and I was, really messing up and falling further and further back. And I was the most pissed off 11-year-old or 10-year-old that you'll ever see. And I ripped off my helmet, and I threw it in the go-kart, and I marched up to my dad and started screaming at him, like, "You messed up the go-kart. If you had done something else, I could have won the race." And then I saw the iciest stare that I've ever seen in my life. And he walked right up to me, looked down, and said, "Fuck you." I know, right? He said, "You asked me to make a change, and I did the absolute best I could. And if it didn't work, it doesn't matter. When you're on the track, it's you and the go-kart, and you need to make it work." And this stuck with me for a little while, but it was so true that he could have actively sabotaged me, and it wouldn't have mattered. I have my job to do when I'm out there. And again, it was a very different message than what I had been told, and I had been taken care of and somewhat sheltered growing up. But when it came to racing, sport, I had to do my job. Other people depended on it. So as I move the podium. So that was another lesson. And the last thing that I find most personally offensive about how women are portrayed in media is that we're fragile, right? Because women are routinely portrayed as emotionally and physically fragile, and we're not. And what's so great about girls in sports is that we're taught to be as strong as we possibly can be, and that's a really good thing because it means that we're getting closer and closer to winning. And so I think that is so powerful, and something that I'm very lucky that as a female in the United States that I can do this, I can do sports. But, if we're talking about the UN Women and the global impact, there are still many countries where girls can't compete in sports. So it's interesting to focus on our issues here with media representation, which are totally valid issues. But then there's also this global issue that, even access to sports on a bunch of different levels. So that's something that I hope to continue to advocate for and help to improve the situation of as I move forward in my racing career. I'm excited to hear more from the rest of the panelists. So thank you.
Well, how do I follow all of that? And I want to admit, I don't like the BMI either, because there's no BMI for 6'3". I'm 6'3", so it's not fair. But thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here tonight. Thank you, Carol. I appreciate my introduction. My background was not in sports. I wanted to be a ballerina. And that's like what little girls are supposed to want to be. And then one day I was in the backyard and my dad was playing catch with my brother. My brother's like 9 years older than me. And I was like, I want to play. So the next day my dad took me to, whoever remembers, like, I'm from the East Coast, if you remember, like, Modell's. My dad took me to Modell's and he bought me a mitt. And we played catch in the backyard. And I was a little girl then. And then I got to high school and my the coach saw me. I've been over 6 feet tall since the 6th grade. And we talk about women in the media, and that's a really hard thing for young girls to deal with, whether they're playing sports or not. It's being different than all the other girls in the school. So the coach saw me walking down the hallway, and he was like, "You're playing basketball." Dad, coach wants me to play basketball. Well, my brother and I were from a small town. My brother went to high school. My dad trusted the coach. Said, "Sure, you can play basketball." Then the softball coach said, "Well, I want you to play softball." I was like, "I'm never even." I was like, "Oh, I've got a mitt. I have a mitt. I have a mitt." And he wanted me to play softball. And then the track coach was like, "Well, I want you to be on the track team." I'm like, "I'm going to be on the track team." I'm like 12 years old. So I'm like, "Oh, I'm a free sport athlete." This is like back in like 1988. So I was kind of feeling myself. But it kind of whittled down to me just being a track and field athlete. And I just am fortunate and very thankful to be a collection of people who always told me I can. So I didn't have that, you can't play this, you can't do this, women and girls are not allowed to do this. I'm a collection of people who told me that I can. And when I got to college, my team was co-ed. So that throws in a different dynamic. I wasn't competing with just the other women on the team, I was competing against the men too. Well, in track and field, there's men's track and field and there's women's track and field, and we don't compete against each other in competition. If you've ever been on a track team, you compete against each other in college. So comparison to me is a curse word because throughout my career, I was always compared to the boys or to the men on the team. For exactly your story. So I'm a junior in college, I've been training for 3 years, and I'm doing pretty well. So a bunch of freshmen come onto the team, and they're not training as hard as they should, they're not getting their strength gains as fast as they should. So the coach, as a punishment to them, they had to train with me. How does me being one of the best throwers in the country become a punishment to an 18-year-old boy? So I got a little angry with my coach. So I was like, well, then I'm going to punish them. And then they got so angry because they weren't stronger than me yet. I was 3 years older than them. You know, I had been training my tail off for the past 3 years. So we're in the weight room and we're doing like power. Does anybody know Olympic lifts, power cleans, and snatches? And I was lifting more than them. They ran out. They would not come back in the weight room with me. Now, men and women are different. Biologically, they're different. So their gains got faster. But I was so annoyed that their punishment was training with me, one of the best throwers in the country. So that's my first story. And then we talk about comparison, to me, is a curse word because who knows what the hammer throw is in here? Okay, like 10 people raise their hand. When I was in college in 1996, it was the first year they had hammer for the women. They'd always had it for the men. And unfortunately, it's not a basketball or a football or a soccer, so no one really knew what it was. So my coach said in an article that went in the state paper, was so excited, my picture was in the state paper, I open up the paper, I get back to my dorm after class, and it says, Dawn Ellerby wins national title. My coach says, yeah, she's like the female Ron Willis. No one knows what the hammer throw is anyway, so why do I have to be the female anything? So I marched right up to him and practiced the next day, and I was like, my name is Dawn Ellerby. I'm not the female Ron Willis. Why did you say that in the newspaper? And I think he was taken aback, because in his eyes, that was the only way to describe to the readers what I was doing, by calling me the female Ron Willis. Then there's a different dynamic in being an athlete, being a female, and then being African American. I grew up on Long Island in New York. I went to school at the University of South Carolina. So I was the first female athlete to compete for the New York Athletic Club. That club has historically been all male and not very diverse. So I remember being at the New York Athletic Club, and they were very supportive of me, so this is not to bash them, They had their first African-American athlete in 1992. They had their first female athlete of the year in 2000. So they had an awards dinner. I was excited. The first female athlete of the year. And my manager at the time said, Dawn, go up to the, forget the name of the floor, go to the 7th floor. They got some gear for you, pick up some gear. I walked up the elevator, and the gentleman told me, stop there, miss, women cannot come on this floor. I'm like, flashback. Female Ron Willis is coming on this floor and getting my gear. So I was like, well, and I had no idea. I've never been told what I couldn't do. I had no idea how to react to that. So I was like, well, I was told to come and get some gear, so where's the equipment room? And the gentlemen on the floor coming in and out of the locker room, they weren't indecent, but they were outraged that I was on that floor. They were outraged that I was on that floor. So those are some of the stories that kind of, as being a female athlete and being a pioneer in my sport, I was the first woman to win a national title for the NCAA, the first female to make the U.S. national team for the Olympics because it was the first year that they had the hammer. So watching the media coverage this year of the 2016 Olympics had some really cringe-worthy moments. And I want to talk a little bit, maybe get some feedback about these. And here's another one. When Ledecky won her gold medal and broke her own record, she was called the female Michael Phelps.
Yeah.
Okay. There was a young woman who won a bronze medal. She was the wife of Chicago Bears lineman. There was another woman who turned herself around in swimming. She was the wife of the husband who helped turn her around. And the final 5 who killed it at the Olympics were referred to as a bunch of giggly girls in the mall. So those are some images that kind of upset me about the media and women's portrayal. And Women's Sport Fitness magazine, that was one of the first magazines I had to be a part of, and I'm so sad to see it leave. And why magazines like that and vehicles for women to have their space in sport is so important is because, like I told you, growing up, I was always over 6 feet tall. And I think you mentioned Gabrielle Reese. My mom didn't know what to do with me, so she would go to the ends of the earth to find pictures of female athletes that were taller than me, bigger than me, stronger than me, and I had a poster of Gabrielle Reese in my room. 6'4" volleyball player. I was like, yes. And because of Women's Sport and Fitness, they had a gala. I got to meet her. I had pictures with her. Because of that gala, I got to meet the likes of Tyra Banks. Because of that gala, Goldie Hawn, Kurt Russell, and Katie Couric were all there for me to touch and talk to because of Women's Sport and Fitness. We don't have that anymore. I got to meet Mia Hamm. But these are people who I idolized growing up. And then now I work in college athletics. And the things that I went through 20 years ago, our women are still going through. So I would like to think the coverage has changed because it has no choice to change. There's really no choice. But the attitudes towards women haven't changed that much. And there's 2 questions that I think female athletes have to deal with. Are you enough or are you too much? Right? Are you strong enough, but are you still dainty? Are you aggressive enough, but are you still sweet? Are you competitive enough, but are you still sensitive? You know, are you too tall? Are you too big? Are you too, in my instance, are you too black? Are you too strong? And that's when I realized what we have to do is stop these, are you enough or are you too much? And we just have to let our girls be a collection of I can. And that's my take. So I appreciate being here tonight, and thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, each of the 4 of you. Now, I don't want to put a lot of pressure on the audience. Now is the time for question and answer. So I just want to say, unless you have questions, I'm going to come and rip your livers out.
I thought, Amy, before we did that with our lovely panel, could you tell us about the torch relay from Seneca Falls to the women's conference in Houston in 1977? Next year is the 40-year anniversary. We'd love to hear that story.
Yeah, you're so innocent, Bond. I suspect that. 1978 was the year of the first National Women's Conference. It was the first political, a very large political event of the second wave women's movement, I guess. And I was teaching at UMass at the time, and president of a group called the National Association of Girls and Women in Sport. And one of the gymnasts on the UMass gymnastics team, mother, was the head of the labor department, the women's department of the labor department, the women's bureau of the labor departments. So she was very connected to the women's movement. And so Catherine, the mother, and Betsy, the daughter, who was the gymnast from UMass, and I were having a jolly time thinking about the conference that was going to happen in about 8 to 10 months in Houston, Texas. And because we were all kind of committed to the sort of things that the people on our panel were talking tonight, the role of the body and empowerment, bodily empowerment with women, embodiment as I call it, we said there's got to be a physicality aspect to the women's conference in Houston. And so just sort of bouncing ideas back and forth, we got the idea of a marathon. It's a marathon for women's equality. A marathon is a symbol of a huge endurance event. So why don't we, and so we got the idea, we're gonna get a torch from Seneca Falls, which was in New York City, upstate New York, down to Houston. And so my organization, the National Association of Girls in Sport, mostly women coaches and PE people nationally, and the Roadrunners Club joined together. And we just pulled the maps out and started tracing what roads would we follow to go from Seneca Falls across to Massachusetts, down through Connecticut, New York, then down the southern coastline, and then cut over to Houston, Texas. And, you know, I was working with Catherine Switzer at the time, trying to get the women's marathon in the Olympic program, because women's marathon wasn't in the Olympic program. So I had some sense about distance running. And I figured even walking, a woman could do 2 miles. Let's divide this into 2-mile segments. So we just broke that trip from Seneca Falls to Houston into 50-mile days. So that meant we had to find 25 people who could do 2 miles each. And started getting people to volunteer, and it was fantastic. There were men who joined in with the runners, pregnant women running, little kids running with their mothers and fathers, and so we got the torch. That was the relay from Seneca Falls to Houston. And if you look at the media materials, to bring it back to media again, if you look at the media materials about this, the women's conference at Houston, the picture of the torch arriving in Houston is really symbolic. It had all of that aspects of embodiment and the kind of things that our panel have been talking about. The media can do so much with an image to communicate so much. Inside the Torch was a poem that Maya Angelou wrote, and about women and coming to freedom and equality and the whole 9 yards. So I encourage you to, if you want to have a fun read, try to maybe Google the Torch relay for the women's conference. So thank you, Bon, for asking about that.
So I ran in that.
Wow.
But it was because I was a student of yours, and one of the things I think about change is that a lot of times there's a lot of people that are ready, and then an opportunity will come, and then it all happened, right? I mean, you know, like that's pretty far. And I went up to Seneca Falls, and then I was also down in Houston, so I ran in both spots. But that's what I've always thought of that people are, if you spend a lot of time and you're thinking and you're working and you're studying, and then something happens, and if you know it's happening, a lot of the world opens up to you. Anyway.
Yes.
with regard to airtime and media time at the Olympics. Now in 2016 in Rio, there were about 290 women and about 260 men, so the women a little bit more. And the women, they won 61 medals and the men 55. So it's pretty equal according to their number. How was the media and airtime for the male and female?
Did you measure that?
I have to say, I didn't measure the Rio Games, but my understanding is it was pretty close to equal, but the Olympics are always anomalous. What's his name is doing it,
It's sort of like, I think, stay tuned.
Yeah.
There will probably, there's a lag time before the data becomes available.
But it's definitely not below 5% like the other
Oh, no. And I would say too that, you know, even past Olympics too, that, I mean, not way back, but the last few Olympics, the coverage of women's sports here in the United States on television has increased and increased. I'm not sure like 50-50, but it's pretty impressive how much coverage they give to the women in the Olympics. And after each Olympic Games, when there's a wave of excitement about the women's soccer team or basketball team or the women's swimmers or whoever, you know, the ones that have all done so much, who've been on the magazine covers as America's darlings, and somebody's daughter and somebody's wife, you know, they get framed in those kind of heterosexual sorts of ways. There's often a lot of enthusiasm and hope that people have that, gee, now maybe this is going to be the tipping point. We're going to get a lot more media attention and coverage. And what's happened in the past is it's just sunk again in terms of coverage of the day-to-day, year-to-year, local and national women's sports. And the way I've explained that, and I think it's more of a cliche than a real good explanation, but I think there's something to it, is that we love it when our women are out there kicking the butts of other women in other countries because nationalism comes in there, but nationalism then is on a day-to-day is trumped by sexism, and I hate to use the word trumped this week, but I think that the sexism that permeates our day-to-day media coverage of women is not overcome by that moment of nationalist excitement. So something else needs to be happening that we would hope would kind of echo or reverberate out of that excitement we get out of watching women in the Olympics.
Please.
So what I've noticed, and I'm sure everyone's noticed it, for female athletes, it's in magazines, everything, it's very sexualized. Like, they don't focus on women's actual athletic abilities. More so, they'll be wearing bathing suits, they'll be wearing skimpy outfits. The interviews won't even be about their accomplishments. And I was just wondering, as female athletes, what do you think you can do, or we can do?
It's a tough question, and it's totally true, and especially I think something that I've been told recently is to, when you get questions specifically that don't relate to your sport, you're in control of your answer, so you can tie it back. You don't have to answer the question. There's an artful way to take a reporter's question and then spin it into your own answer. So I think the more that we can do that, I think if you're comfortable calling out the reporter for the question, but you have to be careful because you need your media relations. But I mean, a lot of it is, certain athletes have control over what they wear for photo shoots. You can always say no, and I think having the strength to be able to push back against if the either magazine or TV is trying to push a certain direction, staying true to what you want to do is really important. And it's tough because sex sells, right? Like, that's something that I'm struggling with now. Oh yeah. There was I'll give a short story, is that there was a production company that was looking to do a show on racing girls. And there are enough girls who race and women who race that we could put a show together. But it was so degrading and so fluffy that, and like, we decided we weren't even going to engage in it because it just really would hurt the brand that we have worked so hard to develop. But so many women were they wanted to jump on it, and so it's so hard, and so many people are going to push that, and really having the strength to be able to say no and recognize that you might make some enemies with that, I think in the long run it's going to be way better because you're going to have so much more depth if you can relate to something else. Not saying like if selling sex is what you want to do, that's fine, but we got to start setting the role model, the path that there's other ways to do it as well.
I think simply supporting women's sporting events That's where the media coverage takes place. I sit on the NCAA Women's Basketball Advancement Committee, and we were having a conversation of how do we get more people to come out to women's games. And from the conversation was, well, we need to show our women more feminine and less aggressive than on the court, right? So I was looking at an article before I came today, and every cover of ESPN News that has a woman on it has her in a bathing suit,
Yeah,
really
that was
sexualized, and every cover of a man has him on a with his jersey
Yeah,
on,
that
showing
was
his
where
strength.
I was getting at.
So I think it's like supporting our female athletes as they are is what's going to help us. So if there's a Sparks game you can go to, if it's a soccer game you can go to, if it's a USC basketball game you can go to, showing our media and people who are putting the funds into women's athletics that you're okay to see them in their natural state. And I think that's what will kind of help move it along. And that's a slow process, but I think it will take action from those who support it.
I think I'd say one thing also, supporting with what Julia was saying, especially younger women feel like they should yield. If they get a question, they try to answer it just as it was presented. So they have, I think those women need to be taught, those young women need to be taught a different way. And this is one of the things that the Women's Sports Foundation and other, if we could organizationally do these kind of things, it would multiply the effect. The Women's Sports Foundation starts with young women, and they start talking to them about how do you talk to the press, how do you talk to the media, how do you make sure you're telling your story and not just whatever they want to do. But there's a kind of like, unfortunately, we've been raised, I think, in such a way that we need to be instructed and given some options, because it's too easy to just fall into answering the question.
Oh, I just wanted to mention Mary Jo Kane's research in the Tucker Center at the University of Minnesota. She's done some fabulous work. There's a free documentary on their website that you can watch. And she actually explicitly looked at the question of, does sex appeal translate to viewership for women's sports? And the answer was no. Sex sells sex. Sex sells products, but it absolutely was not translating to audiences for women's sports.
There's also this quick idea that you can be super attractive and you know, appealing without showing all your skin, right? There's this binary. It's like either you're naked or in a swimsuit, or you're fully covered up in your outfit, uniform, whatever. Like there's a middle ground, and I think that will help with the slow process. Hopefully we speed it up a little bit, but there's middle ground.
Yes.
What do you guys think about sports that might be inherently gendered or feminized? For example, synchronized swimming or like rhythmic gymnastics. Is that like regressive in a way, or is it like okay for women to pursue those kinds of sports?
Well, we were just talking earlier that gymnastics is probably one of the few sports that, although so different in how they show it, is where like men and women for certain routines could totally compete together. Like they could both do beam, they could both do pommel horse, they could both do bars and everything. So it's weird because it is so feminized, and I think you know, that got a lot of Olympic coverage, is the leotards and how pretty they were, and makeup and how much makeup they wear. But at the same time, the sport itself is one of the most physically demanding, and so it's a weird balance of those two.
I could say one quick thing about that, which is something I've been really interested in, is that there are women's football leagues around. Of course, you know, it's you won't see it too much on TV. They don't get too many spectators. There's almost no money in it, and there's also, as you might know, the lingerie football league, which does get on TV, which does have money, and women who play in it get paid for it. And you have to, of course, look a certain way to be in the lingerie football league. But I saw a documentary about this some time ago that was made by a student at USC that was quite good, where she followed around some of the women who in the Los Angeles area who played on a legitimate football team. And they were very committed to it. They worked really hard. They really enjoyed it. And a couple of them also played in the lingerie league. And they said that the reason they played in the lingerie league is because they made money playing in the lingerie league. And so I think there are commercial constraints around women playing certain kinds of sports, and commercial enhancements for women to play other kinds of sports that have to do with channeling women back into a kind of commodified body that they assume male, I mean not the women, but the producers might consume male viewers want to consume.
Yes.
Outside of the media, right, I have a question because you actually, under your speech about creating safe spaces, right? And I actually got into athleticism pretty recently, so I did a triathlon, and ever since I started building muscle, women came up to me, and my aunt actually told me, you know, men don't like it when women are muscular, you know? And I was just like, screw that, you know? But at the same time, I mean, what can we do as a society outside of the media to kind of create a safe space for women, right? Because we are naturally strong, and we're able to do all of these things. And actually, on a related note, because I have a subtext to that question, you also mentioned objectification of men, and I would be interested to know what effect that has on, like, spaces for women to compete in athleticism, right? Because does the objectification of men just kind of reinforce just gender roles in general, you know? Because I can't imagine objectification of any gender benefiting either of them, right?
Well, definitely for safe spaces, a lot of it, some of it's just flat out infrastructural, right? Is there enough safety officers in the area? Lighting, it's crazy how much lighting makes a difference. Like one of the biggest ways public transit is made safer is simply by being really well lit. So some of it's just lighting, some of it's having the safety people there, some of it's having enough people in the space. Some of it's then also policing people that are in the space, because in some cases these parks are full of young men, and the girls still, and the women still don't feel safe being in these spaces. Becky Beal has done some work with that on skate parks up in the Bay Area, and she's found some really interesting things about how it just takes what you have to do to change the climate. And part of it is to change climate is you need leaders changing climate. So you needed, so if you had maybe some kids who said, no, it's okay that they're here, or at the university level, one of the big predictors of how well women are doing at a university is what the leadership's attitude is towards these things on the campus. So that's a really big factor. So you need the infrastructure, you need the leadership, you need the commitment, and you need to have this as a priority. And not just sort of give it up, right? Like, oh, well, kids shouldn't be in parks anyway. Like, I'm hearing these bizarre stories about, like, people calling the police on 10-year-olds in parks, which, that sounds crazy to me because I started going to the park alone when I was 6, and my parents are from New York. They're just like, yeah, go ride the subway, you'll be fine. But, so it's sort of making all those things happen. And on the gender roles side, absolutely, it's not helping men or women. It definitely is reinforcing the idea of gender difference, and not just gender difference, but that gender difference looks a very specific way. So, it's like, you mentioned the difficulty of being a tall woman. In one of my gender classes, I had a guy stand up and he's like, I'm 4'10". He's like, at no point ever in this culture am I seen as desirable or masculine. And he's like, and I'm supposed to date a woman who's shorter than me. Tell me where I'm supposed to find this woman that I'm going to date, right? And he's like, and then, like, oh, you're shorter. Like, what am I supposed to do? Oh, you're shorter than me. Let's get married, right? You're my only option, right? And so we sort of get these very narrow. I think the problem is just the narrowness of these boxes that we're all supposed to fit into, and then the fact that we get marketed very aggressively these things that maybe aren't so good for us. Right? It's not necessarily good for men to be getting as big as they can. It's not necessarily good for women to always try to be getting smaller. And I also interviewed women's professional football players at one point, and a lot of them said, this is the only place in the world where I'm valued, because everywhere else they're telling me lose weight, get smaller, be more feminine. And I remember one woman, she's like, I'm 240 pounds and I'm 6'5". Yeah, I could lose 30 pounds. Yeah, and then I'll be 220 pounds and 6'5". I'm not going to be a dainty little flower. And for men, it's the same thing, right? It's like, and what ends up happening is we all feel like imposters, we all feel anxious, and we all feel bad.
Before we leave this chapter has a lot of work being done on the safe cities concept. Kathy, would you want to comment about safe cities, or not? Not now.
Well, I mean, you're talking about urban spaces, which is fantastic, because that is absolutely a big part of safe space and creating safer spaces for women and girls. Public spaces, I think there were some studies with basketball courts in New York City. Most of the women couldn't access them because it was all men that were on them, all boys.
And then, am I not talking loud enough? And a lot of the work that we've been doing is trying to increase awareness about how important it is to have urban spaces be safe for women and girls. I'm also really interested in the educating boys. He and Women has done some programs for men and boys, which work for them to kick the ball, not the women kind of campaigns for against domestic violence in South Africa is one campaign. There are other campaigns that they're starting to do with Yellow Bus. I think it's another company in, I think it's in India. But they're also expanding to Africa and different countries in Africa, which are about educating young boys about equality and gender equality, and those are really great programs. But I was also wondering if you could also talk a little bit more about educating boys and men in sports and how that could be more progressive in creating safe spaces and inclusive spaces for girls.
Yeah, I can say a little bit about that. Definitely the work that's being done in South Africa, I think, is on the leading edge of a lot of the work in the world, working with boys, and oftentimes using sport. I know in certain parts of India, I've heard, I haven't studied it directly myself, there's been a lot of work around sexual violence prevention with boys through which sport is the vehicle that they're bringing boys into these conversations. In the United States, I think that there are these kind of efforts being made to, and this my most recent book was about men's, especially efforts to work with boys and to prevent sexual violence, to prevent domestic violence in future. But I didn't really find too many places in the United States where sport was the vehicle for that. Now there are activists within sport, and I think one of the main, or two of really the main activists in the United States, Don McPherson and Jackson Katz, who are both former football players, one professional and one college football players, and who use that as a platform for going around and talking to boys and young men about sexual violence, about men's responsibilities to take a stand and to talk to other boys and men, take responsibility for ending violence against women. So I'd say sports is being used as a platform by some leaders, but it's, as far as I know in the United States, not nearly as much being used as a sort of vehicle for bringing boys into the conversation as it is in some parts of the global South.
I just want, Dawn, does the NCAA have any specific programs like maybe, to aim at the men that are in athletics to, they don't have to,
The
they're
one
not doing
program that's going on right now, it's not aimed at gender roles for men and women athletics, but it's called It's On Us, and it's to bring awareness to domestic and dating violence.
Are there metrics that can measure the success of these campaigns, and how do we measure the outcome of the campaign, both yours and the ones that you mentioned?
Yes and no. I mean, it's a major issue with people in the field of domestic violence and sexual violence prevention work, because, for instance, people in domestic violence fields can say they can measure, and it's really important to measure because that's how you get your funding and that's how you maintain your funding. We can measure how many people we've sheltered in our shelters. We can say how many beds that we've filled, but how do you measure something you prevented, something that has not happened because of your education or your organizing efforts? So what they do instead is they try to measure shifting attitudes. That we know there are certain attitudes that boys and men traditionally have held, and sometimes often still do hold, that are correlates with sort of rape-prone behaviors or violence, other sorts of forms of violent behaviors. If we can change those beliefs and attitudes, we can then, by implication, think that maybe we're preventing some future acts of violence. So that's pretty much the best that can be done, and it's one of the reasons why it's really hard to get and maintain funding for these kinds of programs. Most of the men and few women that I interviewed for this project, the book is called Some Men, when I asked them that question about how they assess their success, most of them have pretty poignant anecdotes that they can tell you about this or that thing that happened based on the program that they're running. But in actual kind of measures that would be acceptable for foundations and others that support this kind of work, it's pretty limited.
I think we have time for maybe 2 questions, so here we go. 1 and 1. Okay, 1.
Me? So in a couple of your stories, you mentioned some what are now considered more obvious, more egregious ways in which there's a negative representation. Being the female representation of ex-male athlete, or not being allowed on a floor, which sounds crazy. Perhaps maybe you could speak about what are some more subtle ways that are a little bit more deep-rooted that cause problems, rather than those kind of egregious ways that make the mass media we all hear about. What are some things that are happening right at that root level that we can think about that maybe stop this?
Formulating the proper way to articulate this.
Recalculating.
Well, there's a lot of ways in which men and women interact in sport, and like I'll just give an example from this year. You know, my team owner and I have had some communication problems, and he's not been able to really. He's never had to work with a female racer who races up front, and there's an assertiveness that I have that I think he had some problems with, and being able to accept that I'm still a racer, and you know, he still sees me as someone who's like his daughter's age. So these preconceived notions of what he thought a woman should be like got in the way of the job that we had in racing. And so I think there's subtle ways in terms of, you know, we had a record where 3 women competed in the same race, which is a lot in the 20-car race. And I was all excited. I said, we're about to make history. And he's like, oh, 3 women, cat fight. So it's these little, yeah, I know, right? I'm like, that was not the tone that I was going for here. And it's like these little conversational things that I think for words do really hurt. And, you know, sticks and stones may break my bones. I don't think that's right at all. I mean, words can really hurt. And then as soon as one person says that and the large group hears it, like that just it becomes embedded in the culture that we're working with. So I don't like education, calling him out. I mean, I called him out plenty of times when he's said things that are inappropriate. And it takes usually a day or 2 for him to come back and then say, you know what, you were right. Shouldn't have said that. But I think having that conversation, being open about it, again, that goes back to standing up for what you know is wrong. If you have that type of relationship, then just point it out. But I think verbally and attitudes and those little statements like can be really harmful, especially for like younger girls and women who are developing in sports. Like if he said that to a 13-year-old, it's like, all right, so girls, I shouldn't be happy that there are other women competing with me, right? I should be hating all of them, and that's just not true. So.
I think at the grassroots and youth level, it's great that we have, we try to make it equal between boys and girls, but they're often not the same sport. Like much of my work is with men's basketball, and it's very hard to compare the 2 sports because the dynamic of the game, it's the same game, but the actual sport and what goes around it from a marketing and entertainment standpoint is much, much different. And I would love for our girls to be honored for doing what an athlete can do, not being so special because the women did it, because then that makes it seem like they're going above and beyond when they shouldn't be, even if they're better than a male at the sport. Like I was watching Sports Center, and there recently was a female kicker on a football team who tackled a boy and like knocked him out of bounds, and the reporters made a huge deal of it. So what is that going to mean? Like at the point where she shouldn't have been able to do that. She shouldn't have been able to run fast. She should not have been able to push the boy out of bounds. So what's that going to do to that boy's team when he goes back to practice? You got beat by a girl. So now it becomes punishment for a woman to be excellent in sports to a man. And her being fast and strong has nothing to do with him. He needs to get in the weight room.
Okay, last question. Here we go.
Yeah, we're supposed to quit soon to be out by 9 o'clock, but I wanted to point out one thing, which is right here at Wilshire Boulevard and Pacific Palisades Park was the first women's Olympic racers in 1984, right down the street from here. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Just thinking also that we've been looking at all the different ways that we can make spaces walk to the start of the marathon. Making sure that the space there was, that everybody was included in the space. That's a huge piece that could be added to the park now. Now they're advertised that they have the record.
And Susan
Be there to sort of
Williams was in
fairly.
one year I did the investment, I did five sprints.
Never
And then the main events on that, they changed the rules and said,
But thank you all, that was fantastic. We all learned so much. And thank all of you so much for being here. We are a volunteer organization and 100% volunteer, in fact, and all the work that we do, most of our events are free, but sometimes they are not. But most of the time they are, so we welcome you to become members of the chapter to support the UN Women and all the global work that they do. All your donations, all your memberships go to supporting UN Women programs and policy development. Is Heather Peace here? Are you Heather Peace? Oh, congratulations. Thank you. We encourage athletics in this chapter by having raffle items, and the bicycle that you saw out there was a raffle item from Bike Attack, and Heather won last time. You get to take that home today.
And thank you guys, it's amazing.
Thank you. We've also given away tickets to LA Sparks teams to encourage that. And we could also maybe arrange to give away other tickets for other organizations and something like that to encourage participation while we're watching women's sports, which would be great. So thank you all for being here.